Chapter 86. Let's start this off simple. That not-so-little friend of yours was indeed friendly, yes? That's good. I just wanted to make sure. Too much of what had happened doesn't make sense to me, so I couldn't be sure if my common sense had stopped working along the way. But given your word and the fact that we were still alive, I can somewhat accept that the Titan was friendly. But if he really was, why didn't you just leave the destruction of the camp to him? Was taking them out more important than our mission? Well, if destroying the camp wasn't more important, why did we waste all that time on this if your big friend could have dealt with them? You genuinely wanted to know since you expended way too much for it to be completely pointless, but it seemed like your companion couldn't provide you with the answer you had sought so easily, probably meaning that it was just a little too elaborate to let you guess. If your companion had been willing to simply write a few words down on the ground, the issue could have been solved quite easily, but for some reason he never did. Perhaps it's a spirit thing, though you had the impression that your companion wasn't quite done this time around as he took off one of his armored gloves. Well, my good Sir Knight, since you helped me out I will ask nicely, what's this all about? Showing some skin is hardly the end of the world, and it's not like I tried anything funny till now did I? There's no reason to be so reserved around me, especially if whatever you're considering might help us with our mission. So you're made up of stone. I honestly can't see it. How's that going to help us with bringing me up to date on what happened? Come now, don't look at me like that. We both saw that giant titan of stone that can just stomp whole castles flat. Why would you expect me to be surprised that the inhumanly powerful spirit I call my companion is made of stone? That just doesn't really compare, now does it? Yes, I can see why you wouldn't be surprised, my good Dinah. It's a pleasure to finally write to you. My apologies for the inconvenience. The pleasure is of course all mine, or it most certainly would be, if I actually knew whose words I have the pleasure of reading. Writing on someone else's body like this from who knows where is not exactly comparable to the proven and trustworthy norm our feathered friends provide, so I genuinely need to insist upon receiving something more than just a small number of pleasant words, if at all possible. All in due time, that much I can promise, though that being said, I seem to remember you still had some questions your companion failed to answer, so I believe they should still be taken care of as soon as possible. Well, if you're genuinely offering, you are unnamed friend of mine, I'm sure we will manage to get along just fine if you could truly answer my questions. So now, what had doomed the camp of the mountain clans, and why was this companion of mine needed to take care of it? I do quite love your directness. I agree. Let's begin. The reason for why the traitors had to be taken care of was quite simple despite the fact that different reasons joined it along the way, and that main reason as mentioned before being simple and despicable treachery. House Lannister has offered them everything, from gold and silver, to food and technologies, and not to forget a decent fortune's worth of serviceable arms and equipment without a need for repayment, as we would have been content if they had managed to replace the errands and the Knights of the Vale as they had planned. But despite the great start, things had soon changed for the worse as the fanatics of the old gods had swiftly managed to convince more and more tribes to cease cooperation as their victories mounted, till we realized that even the greatest of the mountain clans that had accepted our gift had fully turned on us. Thus, things needed to be rectified as our plans for the Vale just didn't contain any mention of armed religious fanatics hostile to us, and while we could have wiped them from the face of existence as you had witnessed, the fools still used our gifts, so we knew exactly where they had deployed their best to protect both their spoils and chiefs. Great, so I understand why you made sure their elites would be wiped out as publicly as possible, but where does my companion fit into all of this if you had the Titan so close nearby to wipe them out? Simple, the Titan wasn't nearby. I created it under this knight of ours as he drew in their reinforcements. I expected that their gods would give them some kind of warning which would make sure they overcommitted no matter how vague the warning ended up being, since their false knights and commanders were their only hope of fighting the Knights of the Vale in the open battle when the time came. Are you seriously claiming that you created that monster in less than a day? Naturally, I could hardly hide something that powerful from them as they had the help of their gods, and since your companion was my only stable creation in the Vale that I could take over to create my newest little brother, he obviously needed to be there as our gods were rather stingy with how much of my plans for the Vale they promised to hide from the old gods. Sigh, I really need to know who you really are and some proof to believe any of that stuff, and while I appreciate your willingness to part with this much information, Your claims are just too unbelievable, you still unnamed friend of mine. But our common friend will need a new set of both armor and gambesine either way if the mission is still involving him. That is, if presumably you still wish me to deal with Lord Aaron, I will expect some proof whenever the new armor is ready to be picked up. That seems reasonable enough, and I admit I far prefer the extra step over learning that my new assassin is actually just a gullible fool. Not that I will respond kindly to this mistrust once you have your proof, my good Dinah. Chapter 87. It took you a moment to refocus and think about what else you needed to know, as what was most likely your master felt quite plainly insane, or he would have if you still had any confidence in what did and didn't make sense after the previous day. And even just the thought that such a monster could actually be created by a human at all, and especially within such a short amount of time, was so absolutely terrifying that you had actually failed to keep up the smallest amount of appearances as you simply stated what you needed. On one side, you genuinely wished to praise your conditioning for making sure you hadn't found yourself paralyzed by the terror of the possibilities alone, but on the other side you continued to be bothered that you had apparently managed to slight your master in that shocked state of yours. There had been little in the way of backlash to your show of mistrust, considering the massive difference in standing and the fact that the messages were written and erased on your companion with apparent ease. Yet you couldn't help but wonder if your master's words contained more hidden scorn that someone of your birth just couldn't catch up on. It really felt like life had it out for you this year. Well, you certainly have my thanks for indulging that little whim of mine. I just can't take these abilities of yours alone as proof since I was never actually informed of them, so I hope you will bear with it. You have proven yourself competent enough for me to say that it's fine for now, Ina. Let's just finish what we started, so tell me what else you still wish to know. There might be plenty of time, but that doesn't mean we should waste it. Yes, you have my thanks once more. So, the most pressing concern I have is where the mountain-sized titan has vanished to, and of course what your plans with him are, since you apparently have no intention to unleash him on the errands with how their host down there is still around. I didn't have much use for my little brother beyond dealing with the mountain clans, so he hadn't actually gone anywhere. I simply ordered him to collapse the remains of the camps into the chamber left behind after his creation before I sent him off to create me a net of tunnels for this part of the Vale. And as for the errands, while the mountain clans have fallen out of favor with House Lannister, that doesn't mean the errands have magically become our allies, but since we're no longer interested in replacing the Order of the Vale in its entirety with that of the mountain clans, deploying my little brother wouldn't do. At this point we were simply trying to salvage whatever can still be salvaged to create a balance between the mountain clans that abandoned their faith after the fanatics were wiped out, and the great houses of the Vale, which as far as House Lannister is concerned still very much so requires the disposal of the errands. With how things were going not too long ago, I suppose that I will just count myself lucky that all of the already expended supplies and effort weren't spent in vain. Though that being said, how do the Starks and Baratheons fit into these plans of yours? How much collateral damage can they suffer? I would consider it absolute madness to lie to my own specialist, and I for all intents and purposes promised you some answers as far as I'm concerned, so despite how annoying this is to admit, I had not the slightest idea that either of them had a presence in the Vale. To my knowledge there were a few dozen knights of both the Starks and the Baratheons in the Vale to ensure the safety of Lord Aaron's wards, but that both had already sent entire companies over is as new to me as it is to you, so I don't want you to get rough with them. The focus should remain on the errands as much as possible, and I will make sure that your supplies will be replenished with the same ship that will deliver the new armor to make sure that you have what you will need. It shouldn't take too long to finish, since the original armor he had on him was essentially just a prototype that we have already managed to improve upon. Combined with the fast currents of the Riverlands, I would estimate you can unwind on the shore for about 3 weeks. That's an awfully long time to just waste by sitting around. Is there something else you need us to do on the southern shore? There's currently nothing House Lannister would need you to do down there, so I suppose you could just use one of the chests with captured coins to have some fun on their markets if you write down how the economy copes with all the chaos and bloodshed in return, as that might become useful later on. Certainly preferable to just sitting around. My thanks, though I still need to ask for one more clarification before we will be off. Out with it then, Aina. Yes, well, I already saw that House Lannister had several knights similar to my companion here, and putting that together with your claim of creating that titan, I found myself wondering how long this can remain a secret. Or more plainly, while a 3-meter-tall knight might be a great asset to have, once people know that House Lannister is the one employing them, it might become problematic that such a 3-meter-tall figure appeared and vanished around the same time the good Lord Arryn finds his end. This would indeed be quite problematic, especially with the Starks and Baratheons around to testify his presence later on, but I will take care of that once the time comes. There's after all no point in planning out every detail months ahead with something so volatile that it could change each day. Though I can tell you already that you won't need to hide your allegiance to House Lannister when the time comes to infiltrate the area, as the loot of the mountain clans held 2 treasures far more precious than simple silver and gold. They are so priceless that I'm most certain that returning them will guarantee us the friendship of the great lords of the Vale, which, considering their usual vows of loyalty and honor, will make sure that we will be untouchable. Chapter 88. You had to admit that you were more than a bit curious about this master of yours, as you had never encountered a lord of such power as honest as the one you were apparently serving. But things being as they were, you still had a good bit of work ahead of you before you could leave the Vale and make for the Westerlands, so meeting your lord in person was by that point still a thing of the future, which of course required that you actually succeeded. It was a little bothersome that you and your companion were forced to take some time-consuming detours to evade the host of the errands on your way to the coast, but you had little to complain about, everything considered. Boredom and unplanned detours were simply part of life, and while you would have preferred the soft downward slopes of the Vale's valleys over braving its mountain passes, there were still some good advantages to be had beyond avoiding detection. For one, the once-in-a-lifetime sight of the ravaged valley to your left, as well as the chance to walk on solid ground consistently, and naturally the luxury of actually seeing what awaited you ahead. The wild forests of the Vale had been sufficient when it came to moving unseen by House Arryn, but the sudden and constant encounters you two had with the warriors of the mountain clans had gotten old the moment they had started. And while your companion was an untiring spirit, the thought of genuinely complaining while he carried several times your weight in supplies simply seemed revolting to you. For you had been raised with the mentality that it's best to grit your teeth and get the job done, while you naturally kept anything annoying bound inside, which over time didn't mix well with thoughts of whining in general, despite how often it still happened. You knew of course that it was better to complain about a situation and change it than it was to simply accept and struggle through it, but you were never any good at fixing these things before you managed to get yourself stuck in them. Which was why your former master hadn't even bothered with it. He had been an advocate of strengthening one's strengths long before he had picked you up as experience and thus results, and thus more experience could be guaranteed. Hence, why he had entirely focused on making sure that whatever trouble you managed to get yourself into wouldn't require you to change your way of thinking, though you very much so doubted your master had ever met a Lannister. You had been improvising like a madwoman since they got their hands on you, and the lacking experience in the field of improvisation had come to bite you in the rear far too often, as you found yourself walking behind your companion once more. There was talent in you, and saying that wasn't hubris but a simple fact as far as you or your former master were concerned, the problem being that even the most talented of assassins couldn't beat a walking mountain when it came to killing things, which had once and for all turned your lethality that you had thought of as your greatest strength into nothing more than the requirements for the job. It would take an exceptionally deadly assassin to take care of the Lord of the Vale, that much was clear, but you really weren't anything beyond what was required, which was a problem since you and your greatest talent were only worth as much as the death of the good Lord Arryn. And then it would be entirely up to your new master if you still had so much as a shred of value to him, which was quite the growing concern as you continued to look at the ravaged back of your companion's armor while the hours flew by unnoticed. The supplies he carried had naturally concealed a lot of the damage you had seen before you had departed, but you knew that his back alone had quite literally taken countless blows, even if most had done nothing more than add another scratch. Swords, despite their versatility, just lacked the power required to cut through plate armor, so even the extensive amount of damage that could be seen was still deceptive, as the 3-centimeter thick plates of steel on your companion should have been impervious. Yet despite it all he stood and walked without a problem. These displays of resilience and power had shaken your confidence quite a bit while you two journeyed to the Vale, but even so, the Titan was another matter entirely. If your lord had truly created something that ridiculously powerful from half a continent away within less than a day, the abilities you had focused your training on had truly become useless. From what you knew, you could probably fill the role of House Lannister's best assassin just fine even if you failed to improve in other fields, and since they had their fair share of enemies, you would still have your work cut out for you. But you found after a short moment of thought that you only had disgust for such a mindset, for while you were never the ambitious sort when it came to what you achieved in life, that didn't mean your master had raised a quitter. And quite honestly, you didn't think your pride could have taken it if you remained as expendable as a town guard or the like to someone you might just hold some respect for. Mayhaps you could follow the path of your former master and take on a few apprentices of your own now that you think about it. There might be no single human as devastating as your companion or that titan of your master, but perhaps a few dozen blows in quick success directed at the administration of an enemy house might come in handy. You were still a bit unsure if it was really the right course of action, as you just came up with it, but you very much so doubted that you had the mind to come up with something more refined. But since armies had always expended mountains of resources throughout the ages just to secure the most basic supply lines to stave off the hunger, thirst, and cold, you saw little reason not to prepare the infrastructure to strike where the troops of the Lannisters couldn't. Chapter 89. And luckily these promising little ideas for the future had swiftly managed to change your mood as you finally fortified your mind anew, and after a moment of realization you supposed once more that there were fates far worse than serving the Lannisters. Had it been up to you then you would have naturally remained free, but you knew that few had the luxury and ability to simply defy the world as your new master had done, so there was everything considered nothing left to do but to bow your head like everyone else. Anything else would have just been madness, and as far as you were concerned it really didn't matter if the madness stemmed from defying such power out of misguided pride or a genuine wish for freedom, as opposing your master would assuredly still end the same way. And as if to make sure that you wouldn't change your mind again, your companion silently stopped for the day, so you could rest and prepare for the last stretch of the journey as he threw you one of his heavy pouches filled to the brim with silver before he stripped his gauntlet once more. That's an awful lot of silver, but I understand that gold might be a bit problematic. Still, could you explain what I'm supposed to do with that much silver again? If I remember it correctly, the town you sent us to is supposed to be pretty small, right? Quite so, Aina, but while the price and amount of local goods won't be too outrageously different from other places in the realm, it isn't like the value of the merchandise in Nora's harbor district will follow the same standard for prices we have in the West. The prices of a port town on the western side of the continent just can't be compared with the ones on the eastern side, so much so that it's hard to even tell which goods will be more expensive, and which ones will be cheaper. Besides, nobles of the Westerlands are never seen without some coins on their person, even if it's just silver. If it's too bothersome like that we could split it into smaller pouches. But let's leave that for later. You're of course still free to use it however you see fit as long as I get my report on the local state of the economy once the ship I sent delivers its crew and cargo. I think you added there's something we hadn't discussed, my lord. I honestly can't see a problem with what I wrote, Aina. It's obvious that House Lannister needs its own presence in the Vale since the Starks and Baratheons are already here, and that presence naturally needs more than 2 people and of course some kind of leader. I get that, but I can't play a noble no matter how much coin you're willing to throw around, Master. I don't have the slightest idea where to even start. Playing nobility was never something I needed. The role of servant was always far more logical for my profession. Who said anything about playing a noble? You are one, Aina. Most lords of the Westerlands are needed where they are, and the rest are still occupied with securing our new holdings, and it wouldn't look good if we would send only a bunch of commoners and knights to deal with the great lords of the Vale. Normally the amount of land a house controls would be directly tied to its power, but House Lannister isn't all that dependent on it with our land reclamation effort and the Rock being the Rock, so it wasn't that hard to get you a few villages and a keep to create House Wadner. I understand that you mean well, my lord, but that seems absolutely insane, and actually giving me a title and land won't change the fact that I have genuinely no clue how a competent noble would act in my situation. It's a bit disappointing that you still don't understand my plan, Aina, but we have time, so it's not the end of the world. You might be a noble, but you were sent as a direct vassal of House Lannister to represent us in the Vale, not because you were groomed to be a diplomat. What really matters is the standing of House Wadner as one of our direct vassals in the Westerlands. The Lords of the Vale won't care too much about everything else as long as you show the basic qualities they would tie to being a noble, such as loyalty to your liege and pride in your standing. Sigh, I will do as you wish, my lord, though I still have my doubts. I'm confident that things will work out, Aina, So just focus on your work and collect your proof of my authority once it's delivered, and do not fall to despair over such simple matters. The worst that can happen is that they send a letter of complaint to the Rock, which won't change anything. Very well, my lord. Going back to I believe you called it Nora, what can you tell me about the town? Is there a special reason you chose it? There were no special reasons beyond its location, as the archives of my house don't contain much about towns of that size so far away from the Westerlands, but its walls are, as far as I'm aware, still made of wood, so it shouldn't have attracted too many refugees, but since Nora contains some 800 homesteads, it's really up to chance. Well, if Nora turns out to be overrun with refugees, I still want to know about it in your report, but it's all in all a rather normal town you might find on any coast of our continent, which is why it's ideal to serve the role it serves. Any more questions, Ina? Yes, my lord, I still have a last one for today. How will we communicate once your men arrive? Are they aware of your abilities? I'm not quite sure myself just how aware they are of what I can do, though that being said, each one has served House Lannister for long enough to be trustworthy if it came down to it. But anyways, once you nudge your companion about conversing with me, it's only a matter of time till I will respond. Ina. Chapter 90. The remainder of the journey after that had simply continued to go by peacefully, well, peacefully by Mountain Clan territory standards, but that was still enough for you to think a bit more about your new master. There was a certain charm to him, as if he knew exactly what he needed to say to lead the conversation while he still retained that enticingly sociable feeling about him. You wouldn't have called him irresistible from your handful of interactions, but there was also a certain limit to how much charisma one could bring to bear over this new form of communication your master had created. If you had to put it simply, you were getting a bit worried that your liege would turn out to be one of those people you just couldn't say no to, which you couldn't imagine mixed well with his apparent lack of common sense. It would have helped if your master had something that made him just once seem human for a change, as you wouldn't have been surprised if he seriously ordered you to do the impossible in a month's time with how things had been going. Though in all seriousness, this lack of understanding you had of your liege continued to bother you even now, despite the fact that you would have been fine with serving under a monster or lunatic if the situation demanded it. There reasonably was no need to fear the future with everything your master had already thrown your way, but on the other side the question became what reasonable person gave away keeps and land as if it was nothing. Everything he had demanded of you till now had been quite manageable, which you would thank the gods for once you reached Nora for sure, yet despite everything working out so far you still couldn't help but wonder how long that would last. But while it annoyed and unnerved you to no end, you still decided that your focus on things you couldn't change was just a waste that didn't get you anywhere, opposed to your companion's brisk pace that your body had struggled to match while your mind had been occupied. It was easy to forget from time to time as your body practically moved on its own on these hidden paths, but your companion wasn't the type to slow down if he wasn't prompted to do so. You had seen all kinds of towns and castles while your master had applied the finishing touches to your training, and thus you had naturally learned to tell apart the smallest of differences to avoid clashes with the locals. But what you found in Nora was still a surprise. Each village, town, and even castle had its own set of factions it was structured around that assassins such as yourself could use for 5 or 6 coins of silver depending on the region. But there was naturally an equal number of factions that were best left alone by your kind, or that was how it should have been. Nora, however, had turned out to be a mess of astonishing proportions. Your master's decision to leave your companion behind by the broken keep defending the paths of the mountain clans had been right, even if the reason for that was not what either of you had expected. Nora quite understandably housed far more than just its original 4,000 inhabitants, though what was less predictable was that the town had been turned into what you could only call a siege camp, as the castle of House Palno was relentlessly assaulted by the commoners of Nora. Had your companion been here with you, the whole town would have known about you two within the hour, and you didn't even want to guess how many of these people would have gotten themselves killed, not to mention the aftermath, as Nora would be the place the delegation of House Lannister would officially land. And once you add the merchants on top of the fact that Nora couldn't be erased from the map, a massacre by the hands of your companion here would have been an absolute disaster that might have even required a scapegoat. Pretty dangerous indeed. Well, it was what it was, and at least your task concerning those reports about the state of Nora's economy won't be needed anymore with the seemingly boundless madness running rampant in the streets. It reminded you a bit of your home, the old one of course, but your home remained just that, even if you had quite a few others filled with a lot more warmth in the last few years. Opposed to the past, you would have really loved to do more than just reminisce, as you had quite a few new experiences you desired to make since you could nowadays walk these streets without fear. Such perpetual chaos and the scum it brought to the surface was hard to come by, but letting loose to take care of the scum you knew was there was sadly out of the question, doubly so because you had apparently become a noble of the Westerlands. It was annoying in the extreme, but those were the natural downsides you had albeit very grudgingly accepted as you chained yourself to your new master. Perhaps your chains would loosen a bit once the Lannisters decided to move more openly, but till then killing was only allowed on the job. The question now being what your master would want you to do in all this chaos. You could see a part of him that would be overjoyed if you managed to intensify the madness and chaos that was so happily festering in the open. Yet, from what you understood of House Lannister's greater plans, they wanted to take out House Arryn and in the long run take over a splintered but still savable Vale. Nora itself wasn't important, and neither was House Palno, but if it remained intact, the port would still make for a decent asset when the time came to rebuild. Your poison supplies were practically non-existent, since the right ingredients to replace your losses were pretty hard to come by, as the heartland of the Vale was naturally quite the isolated place. But considering that the harbour was the only place in Nora that was still somewhat intact as trade was what kept the town alive, you were sure you could hunt down enough of the more common ingredients to open up a few more options. Options like taking care of Nora's water supply, with how even the few remaining factions that kept up the bare minimum of public order in the harbour district were more concerned with watching over the ships and warehouses than they were with watching over Nora's wells. The rebellion could be ended overnight.